help me give a warm welcome to Laura, who's going to be talking to us about the 5 types of poverty. Thank you, Laura. You have the floor.
Thanks, guys. Good morning. It's good to see so many people today. I'm going to admit something, and that is I'm a little bit thrown by the news about Bobby, so I'm going to do the best I can, given the situation. I just, for those who may not know it, one of the reasons I wanted to give this talk today is my current job. I'm a community resources navigator. I work a lot with people receiving food benefits, but I work at a college. I work a lot with students. And so just so you know, I have a bias, as most of us do. I am not an expert by any means on this topic, but I mostly want to do a real kind of overview. I think the title is misleading. I want to say that if you do a search for types of poverty, you're going to get all more than 5, less than 5. What do you mean by poverty? Because there's also people talk about, emotional poverty or spiritual poverty. And today I just want to talk about financial poverty. I'm going to mainly be talking about the United States in general, although some of the stuff I'm going to show you, for instance, there's an infographic from the United Kingdom. So just know that some of these are kind of generalizations. So I'm going to try something new today, and I'm going to show you an infographic briefly to talk about, so you know that the types of poverty I'm going to be touching on when I say 5 types of poverty. So since I haven't done this before, this could be interesting. Let's see if this works. They told me it worked earlier, so we will see. So hopefully, and I don't know if I can make this bigger. I know sometimes this is small. But this is an infographic I found online, and I was going to cite my sources, and then my internet went down this morning, right before now. So I found this one on Pinterest. I was going to locate where they got this information from, but this is the 5 types of poverty that I have investigated since I started working about a year and a half ago, with food and housing insecurity. So for those who may not be able to see it very well, it's a little infographic. So it says, number 1, absolute poverty. People in absolute poverty lack basic necessities like a roof over their head, food, and water. The only focus is on surviving each day as it comes. And then number 2 would be generational poverty. This involves 2 generations or more, obviously, born into poverty. These people usually do not have the tools to get themselves out of it. Going to talk about language in a bit. I feel like this language is a little harsh. There's relative poverty. So, and again, we're talking financial. So relative poverty. So this is the type of poverty relative to the average standard of living in a person's society. What is considered high income in one country could be considered middle or low income in another place, another country. The 4th that's listed on this infographic is urban poverty. And this says this type of poverty is only for metropolitan areas and populations of over 50,000 folks. Overcrowding, violence, noise, and poor community health programs make it even more difficult for people suffering, here again language, of this type of poverty to get out of it. And then number 5 is rural poverty. The low population limits services available for people struggling financially, and a lack of job opportunities only compounds the problem. So that's kind of what I'm going to touch on. There's actually different things that aren't on this infographic that we may consider. And so that could be immigrant populations that are experiencing poverty. And there's also another idea called temporary poverty. So this could be someone that was middle class or higher even, and they experienced some sort of setback, an illness, a job loss. And so they may lose their status, lose their ability to pay their bills. And when we say it's temporary, often they can recover because they may have access to resources that other people don't, but sometimes they don't recover. And so they may slip into, any of these other areas. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so you can see me. I'm going to share some more stuff later. But I want to talk about why do we even care to talk about poverty? And right now, I'm not seeing my notes. Really? Is that really what's going to happen? Fun. Oh, okay, here we go. So as I told you before, I find it important to talk about poverty because it's something I've been working with. I've been working with people experiencing poverty, both in human services and in higher education for decades now, on and off. And just my personal observation is for those folks who work in my fields, some of them have never experienced poverty themselves. And so there sometimes can be a disconnect between how they're helping people and kind of what works well. So, or it could be that there's a person who's only experienced one kind of poverty and they're working with clients or customers or students, and they sort of think, well, I've been through this, and so I understand where this person is coming from. And that may or may not be the case. I like to give examples and stories. So an example, once I was working as a career navigator for a local community-based organization, and that's someone who helps low-income folks with figuring out, do they need training? Do they need help with job search? How do we get them back to work or into higher paying jobs? And I was talking to a fellow career navigator I had just met, and he was an immigrant, I think second generation. His family been in the country and he was born in the country, but he comes from an immigrant background. He worked with young people going to school. So I think max age 24. And he himself was pretty young. And I had found out that he was working full-time and going to school full-time. And I thought, wow, that's a lot. So I said to him, how is that going? I kind of raised eyebrows. So how are you doing? And he laughed and he said, the only people that struggle with working full-time and going to school full-time are people that party too hard. And I went, or single mothers, or people fleeing domestic violence, or people experiencing depression, or those who are disabled, or I just started rattling off other situations. I didn't even think about it. It wasn't even flippant. It was just like, I could think of dozens of reasons why partying has nothing to do with the fact that I might not be able to work full-time and go to school full-time and be successful. And at the time, it didn't bother me. I didn't think so much about the situation. But when I walked away, it really started to bother me because I thought, here's a person who's supposed to be helping folks who has a certain attitude about, well, if you're not successful, it's because you are being irresponsible. And I felt like, wow, that's really, unfortunately, I never met him again. He worked in a totally different area. It was a big networking event. So I don't even think we worked for the same organization. But it just really struck me, not knowing his background, but just thinking, how is this person helping other people who are maybe, facing barriers to their success and kind of going, well, you're just not, because he was able to do it, right? He was able to do it. I don't know if he ever experienced poverty. Maybe he didn't. But it really struck me. But then many of you would be like, well, Laura, I don't work in human services. Why should I care? And that's fair. That's a question. That's a fair question, right? So other things to consider. We just had an election, and I'm not going to get political, but I just want to think about, one of the choices I had was to vote for a public utilities commissioner in Linwood, where I live in Snohomish County. And they weren't controversial, the two choices. They're two white dudes, Looking over the information about them, I went with a fella who has been working on trying to expand broadband services in rural areas. That was the thing that got me to vote for him. It doesn't affect me. I don't live in a rural area. So I mean, counties like Camino Island, because they don't have access to broadband. Many people in that area don't have access to broadband. And that has become sort of critical. It's almost, I kind of see it as, it really is a utility. In order for a society right now to function in this setting, people need access to the internet. So even though that doesn't affect me, I know it affects kids trying to learn. I know that society struggles. I think about how our awareness of poverty situations can affect the solutions that we give to each other or suggest in society. So thinking back at the beginning of the whole COVID situation, there was a lot that was unknown, and we're trying to figure out how to protect ourselves. And there was a run on hand sanitizers, right? Nobody could find hand sanitizer. And then I just saw a lot on social media about, well, why are we even using hand sanitizers, right? The most effective thing is to wash your hands for 20 seconds in hot water and soap. And I don't know, who's sick of singing happy birthday themselves. I switched to Erasure's the first verse and chorus of give a little respect. That's what I sing. Okay. But I immediately thought, well, what about the frontline worker cashier who can't take a break every time she has an interaction with a customer to go wash her hands? Or the delivery driver, where there's not access to public restrooms so much anymore, even less, right? I think about, there's people living in places like Flint, Michigan, where the water isn't safe. There's a whole spate of articles about people living on Native American reservations, and there is no running water. So why is this important if it doesn't affect you? Well, we have to stop the spread of a disease. And so if we only contemptuously say, just wash your hands, what's wrong with you? And not think about the barriers people have to washing their hands, then we have enormous spread in areas, right? So instead we could go, well, can you wash your hands? Okay, if you can't wash your hands, what can we do to make it so you can wash your hands? And if we can't fix that problem, maybe we need to get you hand sanitizer, and maybe that's okay. So those are just reasons why we might want to talk about this topic. And then just personally, sorry, this topic is important to me. I'm going to try to share my screen again. Because of these little cuties. And I don't know who might have guessed this, but that's me and my sisters. And I have spent almost my entire life in poverty. So top left corner, my dad, my little sister Noelle. Top right corner, me with my bouffant. My older sister Kelly, myself in the middle, and Noelle in front of a very tinseled Christmas tree because that's what we could afford for decorations. And then some 70s couch. I think hopefully you guys can figure out the big pumpkin head in the middle. That's me. And then let's see, my grandma on one side, my grandma Abernathy, our terrible 70s clothes. I don't know what we're doing. We're dancing, I think. My grandma Franklin, we're on a bus to Chicago because we didn't own a car. The reason the pictures are so awful is because they're literally pictures I took of pictures in photo albums when I visited Leah's time. So that's what I got. That's our infographic from earlier. Just to get back to sort of more factual things, this is an infographic from the UK, and I did get the website. So it just talks about different levels of poverty instead of types. So you could be destitute, so you may not be able to afford to eat or keep clean or stay warm and dry. The minimum income standard to them is probably like our federal poverty level. Not enough income would be falling substantially short of a decent standard of living, with a high chance of not meeting needs, what we might call housing or food insecure. And then income below minimum income standards. So this is getting by day to day, but under pressure, difficult to manage unexpected costs and events. And then folks who are living above those lines. And I touched on it earlier, we live in a society, and we're probably going to run into this more and more as things like eviction moratoriums cease, unemployment, they stop paying as much, and so on. We're going to have more people experiencing poverty, hopefully temporarily, but we don't know what that's going to look like. Now, this next little infographic is about someone experiencing sort of chronic poverty. And I really want to highlight this because this cycle doesn't apply necessarily to everyone, but things to think about is, if your household is poor, that you may not have food, that you don't have clean water, you may not have access to school. This makes you vulnerable to disease. You might not have a lot of energy or strength or skills to work. If you are working, it may lead to low productivity, which leads to low or no income. This low self-esteem or person control I'm going to talk about in a second. And then high childbirth, sick elderly, more dependence, and back to poor household. The reason I want us to be careful about language is this isn't always the case. So when we look at immigrant populations, the low self-esteem is actually rare, even if they are experiencing poverty. Even those, not everyone, of course, these are generalizations, but much of the time when immigrants come to the United States, if they are experiencing poverty, they often look at it as a systemic issue rather than a personal failing, because the US is pretty strong on the personal failing and not looking at the structures of the issues that people are facing. So when we say, hey, that person is experiencing poverty, they probably don't think, feel very good about themselves. That may not be the case, right? Or the person who's temporarily experiencing poverty, they may have a very high self-esteem and just like, well, again, it's situational. It's not me. We know that if we think it's ourselves, it may be harder for us to do the things that are going to bring us out of poverty. We're going to have a mindset that's really different. I realized that I'm not gauging time. So I was trying to keep this to half hour, 40 minutes, and then I lost track of where I started. So I'm just going to keep going. But here's another infographic that just talks about if someone goes through economic decline, it can affect their income, less access to food, safe water, hunger and poor sanitation. There's disease, potential malnutrition and death, depleted workforce, and back to the economic decline. Most of us, when we hear about food stamps, don't think of actual stamps. They weren't really stamps. I found examples. So when I was growing up, I spent the first 6 or 7 years of my life in a little town called Mishawaka, Indiana. Very, lots of poverty. They looked like this. I remember my grandma tearing them out of a booklet. They were usually $5 denominations. She would stand in line after she got her groceries, figure out how many she needed, and pull them out. One thing, the reason I show this is people will talk that there was a change in food stamps to become what they call EBT cards. This is current examples in Indiana. So they're more like little debit cards or credit cards. And a big reason for that change was the stigma of using food stamps. I didn't experience stigma. I didn't notice it. Of course, I was a kid, but I don't think my grandma was ashamed of it. Most of the people in Mishawaka were using food stamps. That was normal. That was a normal thing. Since I'm realizing I'm going to run out of time, I just want to talk about, I did not feel ashamed of being poor until I moved into a city. I also didn't go hungry until I moved into a city. Because we had a garden. My grandma had a giant garden. This is my grandma's house. She's not there anymore. She passed away, but this is on East 5th Street in Mishawaka. And it's been sold, unfortunately, so I don't have a great picture, but this is Google Maps picture of it. I remember that porch. I remember this tree is new. There used to be a giant tree there. Later, you get lightning bugs, build up. We used to fish. She used to feed us squirrel and rabbit out of her garden. Now we still use food stamps, right? Because, we didn't have cow. So milk, actual regular meat, things like that. I also, though, remember stealing toilet paper from public restrooms as a kid, because you can't get toilet paper food stamps. You couldn't at the time. I don't know if there's some issues now. We were generationally poor. This is my great grandmother Sandusky is on the left, and my grandma Lucille is the very intense little girl in the corner. She had a 3rd grade education. I feel really fortunate that I got to get out of poverty, if you will, to some extent by us moving away from Mishawaka. I got some more opportunities, but again, we moved to Jacksonville, Florida, and there was a lot more crime, and there wasn't the community supports, and people weren't taking care of each other's kids, and there wasn't a community garden. Here's my grandma with my little sister in her community garden that she tended until she died. And she fed family, community members. On the other hand, she did this amazing work. I don't remember a time when my grandma didn't complain about her back. My whole life. Here she is getting an award for elder care. And she was taking care of her brother and other folks, but her brother especially, who had experienced what they call at the time shell shock from the war. And he really he was, what I remember from JE was that he acted about like he was 5. So, but what I think about when I see this is she had a house. She had a place to take care of JE. And many of my family members lived in that house, in the basement, in the attic, sometimes in an RV. So I think about folks who are in apartments and urban settings, and they don't have that opportunity to take care of their family. And then here's me. This is the really awful picture. Why I like to show this picture, that haircut is the result of poverty. Just so you know, my clothing also. The glasses were hand-me-downs from my mother. I was using my mother's glasses for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. We were both nearsighted, but as you know, prescriptions vary when it comes to glasses. I'm going to stop sharing. How are we for time? Like 5-10 minutes? Okay. There's a lot out there. I guess I just want to talk about, so usually when I do talks like this, I do a much longer talk. So I'm feeling really pressured, but I just want people to think about the circumstances can be really different. So, I think about the fact that sometimes people are like, well, if you're poor in a depressed area, move out of the area. But that doesn't mean that there's opportunities in cities for people, right? I think about the fact that we were watched by, my sisters and I were watched by many, many relatives because my mom was a working mom. And when she moved to Jacksonville, she was a computer programmer. She was programming for banks in the 70s, right? You'd think she'd be making decent wages, but my dad wasn't very stable. And so, I remember being woken up several times in the middle of the night and being told, gather everything you can, we got to get out of here. And I realized as an adult, we had been evicted. But as a kid, I didn't know what was happening, right? So, but she didn't have a family to move in with. I remember being at her bank at 2:00 in the morning because she didn't have anyone to watch us when she was working on a situation where their system went down, like many times. People who experience poverty, in rural areas may really depend on their community. And so taking them away from the community, they don't know what to do. They don't have the language for things like going to school or college. I didn't even think about going to college. I did. I ended up putting myself through college. People may not trust agencies to help them, right? They may not believe politicians or other people saying, we're going to help you. And a lot of times those solutions don't work because people don't look into how they work, what is needed. People don't look into the strengths that already exist. They're like, here's how you solve your problem, and it doesn't work. I'm gonna, so I don't run out of time. One of my favorite stories when I was doing some training on poverty is there was a woman who was complaining to the Everett Gospel Mission about the fact that the druggies under the near the train station in Everett did not want her healthy food. And she had felt moved to go onto the street and provide healthy food to the people experiencing homelessness. Now, she called them druggies, and yes, there's drug use, absolutely. So the person she was complaining to said, can you tell me more about the situation? Can you tell me about your healthy food? And the woman said, well, I brought them apples and granola bars. Now, some people may be able to figure out now why they wouldn't want apples and granola bars. And if you can't figure that out, it's probably because they don't have access to dental care. And certain drugs are going to affect your teeth. If I can't eat your healthy food is useless. So really, again, not an expert on this. And given the time, I just want to give people a taste of why we might want to think about the experiences that people are going through and understand that how people experience things like poverty is really individual, and that we can, if we want to address those problems, I think we do, because I think as a society we do better, as everyone does better, then we need to start thinking about a more complex problem, right? and addressing barriers in ways, identifying barriers and identifying strengths and addressing that in a way that makes us all more successful. I really, when I like to do these presentations, for me, the biggest, most important part is the discussion afterwards. And so I think I'm going to wrap up. I'm sorry if I was a little thrown, but I just really appreciate you guys coming and listening. I'm happy to talk about anything. I can show you more horrible pictures of me as a child. But that's really all I'm going to go over, but I'm happy to talk more during the discussion, and thank you so much.